The year was 1956, and the rain fell in sheets across the dark New York streets, the kind of rain that soaks through your clothes in seconds, that turns the city into a maze of reflections and shadows. For most, it was just another miserable evening to be endured. But for Eugene Hackman, a 26-year-old former Marine with dreams bigger than his bank account, it was the night that would change everything. Gene hunched his shoulders against the downpour, his worn leather jacket offering little protection as he hurried down 42nd Street. The neon lights of the theater district blurred through the rain, each marquee a painful reminder of where he wanted to be and wasn't. 3 years he'd been in New York now, chasing the actor's dream, and what did he have to show for it? A collection of rejection slips, a cramped apartment shared with 2 other struggling actors, and a growing sense that maybe his father had been right all along. "You'll never make it," the old man had told him. "Come back to Danville, get a real job." Maybe it was time to listen. Gene ducked into the doorway of an office building, shaking the water from his hair. This wasn't how he'd pictured his life. When he'd left the Marines, he'd had such certainty then, such belief in his own talent. Now, after another failed audition, this one for a small off-Broadway production where the director had barely looked at him, that certainty was fading fast. He had exactly $17 to his name, rent was due in a week, and his roommates, Brian Williams and Daniel Jackson, were getting tired of covering for him. At 30, he'd be officially too old to be called a young actor. The clock was ticking. With a deep breath, Gene stepped back into the rain. He had a night shift to get to, security guard at the Museum of Modern Art. It wasn't Broadway, but it paid, barely. As he walked, he rehearsed lines in his head as he always did. Today it was Shakespeare, tomorrow it might be Tennessee Williams. It didn't matter that no one was listening. He couldn't stop himself. To be or not to be, he muttered, his voice lost in the storm. The museum stood like an elegant fortress in the downpour, its modernist facade a stark contrast to the ornate buildings surrounding it. Gene nodded to Thomas Hayes, the day guard who was just finishing his shift, and signed in at the security desk. "You're late, Hackman," said Kevin Smith, the head of security, not bothering to look up from his clipboard. "Sorry," Gene replied, though he wasn't. The museum, after hours, had become his stage, the empty galleries his audience. Here, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, he could practice his craft without judgment, his voice echoing off marble floors and white walls. Kevin handed him a flashlight. "A new exhibit on the 3rd floor? Check it twice every round?" Gene nodded, taking the flashlight and heading for the locker room to change into his uniform. The navy blue outfit with its shiny badge was a far cry from the costumes he dreamed of wearing, but it was what he had for now. The night stretched ahead, long and quiet. Gene made his rounds methodically, his footsteps echoing through the empty galleries. He paused occasionally before a painting or sculpture, studying the way the artists had captured emotion, hoping to absorb something he could use in his own performances. It was close to midnight when he reached the 3rd floor. The new exhibit was a collection of abstract expressionist works, large canvases splashed with color and emotion. Gene moved slowly among them, his flashlight beam picking out details. "You know, Pollock believed the artist should physically be in the painting." The voice came from the shadows near a fire exit, startling Gene so badly he nearly dropped his flashlight. Spinning around, he found himself face to face with a man he hadn't noticed during his initial sweep. The stranger was in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and a face lined with experience. He wore the uniform of the museum's janitorial staff, but there was something in the way he carried himself that seemed at odds with the blue coveralls. "Sir, the museum is closed," Gene said, automatically falling into his security guard role. "You'll need to leave." The man smiled, unbothered. "Just finishing up." He gestured to a mop and bucket nearby. "Alan Maldonado, maintenance." Gene relaxed slightly, but remained professional. "You should have signed out by now, Mr. Maldonado." "Alan, please." The older man moved toward one of the paintings, A Jackson. Pollock, Jean now realized. And miss the chance to have these all to myself for a few minutes? Look at this one. He pointed to the canvas, a chaotic swirl of drips and splashes. See how he's captured pure emotion? No filter, no performance, just raw feeling. Despite himself, Jean was intrigued. There was something in Alan's voice, a depth of understanding, a passion that resonated with him. You know a lot about art, Jean observed. Alan shrugged. I know. About expression, about finding truth. He looked at Jean with surprising intensity. That's what you're looking for too, isn't it? When you recite Hamlet to the Renaissance paintings downstairs. Jean felt his face flush. You heard that? 3 nights ago, and Macbeth the night before that. Alan smiled again, but there was no mockery in it. You've got a good voice, strong, but you're holding back. The criticism, gentle as it was, stung. I'm not. You are, Alan insisted. You're reciting, not living. He gestured to the Pollock again. You see this? This isn't a painting of emotion, it is emotion. That's what you need to find, not the words, but the feeling behind them. Jean stared at the older man, torn between defensiveness and curiosity. Who are you? Really? Alan Maldonado's eyes crinkled at the corners. Just a janitor who's seen a lot of performances in his time. He picked up his mop and bucket. You should get back to your rounds, Mr. Hackman. But if you ever want to really understand Shakespeare, I'm here most nights. With that, he disappeared through the fire exit, leaving Jean standing alone with the abstract paintings and a head full of questions. For the rest of his shift, Jean couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter. There had been something familiar about Alan, something he couldn't quite place. And how did the janitor know his name? He hadn't introduced himself. The next morning, as Jean was signing out, he caught Kevin Smith before he left. Hey, that janitor, Alan. Maldonado. How long has he worked here? Kevin frowned. Maldonado. Don't have anyone by that name on maintenance. Jean felt a chill run down his spine. Older guy, gray hair, works nights? Night crew is Antonio Hill and Michael Murray. No Alan. For a moment, Jean wondered if he'd imagined the whole encounter. But no, the conversation had been too real, the critique too specific. He resolved to get to the bottom of it the following night. When he arrived for his shift, Jean immediately noticed a difference in the atmosphere. The usual quiet of the museum after hours was disturbed by voices coming from the staff lounge. Curious, he poked his head in and found a small group of security guards and maintenance workers gathered around someone he couldn't see. Hackman, Thomas Hayes called out, waving him over. Come meet our guest. The crowd parted, and there, sitting comfortably in a folding chair, was Alan Maldonado. Only he wasn't in janitor's coveralls tonight. He wore a well-tailored suit, and now that Jean saw him in proper lighting, there was no mistaking who he was. Richard Anderson, the Richard Anderson, Broadway legend, Tony Award winner, now a respected film actor as well. Jean had seen him perform Lear at the Old Vic during a special engagement 3 years ago. It was one of the performances that had convinced him to pursue acting himself. Anderson's eyes found Jean's, and a smile spread across his face. Ah, Mr. Hackman, I was hoping you'd be here tonight. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at Jean, who stood frozen in the doorway. You know each other? Kevin Smith asked, clearly confused. We met briefly last night, Anderson replied smoothly. I was doing a bit of research for a role. Jean found his voice at last. You were pretending to be a janitor. Anderson shrugged, unapologetic. I find it useful to observe real people in their natural environments. Museums after hours are fascinating places. One of the security guards, Brett Perry, laughed. Wait until the board hears that Richard Anderson was sneaking around as a janitor. I'd prefer if they didn't, Anderson said lightly, but there was steel beneath his charm. I've made arrangements with the director for my little explorations. Complete confidentiality was part of the deal. The message was clear, and the guards nodded in understanding. This wasn't gossip to be spread around. "Well," Kevin said, clearly eager to move on, "Mr. Anderson was just telling us about his upcoming film. He'll be here for a few more nights, getting a feel for the museum for his role as a curator." "An art thief, actually," Anderson corrected with a twinkle in his eye, "but close enough." There were appreciative chuckles, and the conversation resumed. Jean stood awkwardly at the edge of the group, not quite belonging, until Anderson stood up and approached him. "Mr. Hackman, would you mind giving me a tour of the third floor again? I'm particularly interested in the security measures around the abstract expressionists." It wasn't really a request, and Jean found himself leading the famous actor back up to the Pollock exhibit. They walked in silence until they were alone among the paintings. "Why did you pretend to be a janitor?" Jean asked finally. Anderson studied a de Kooning canvas before answering. "I rarely get to observe people as themselves. Everyone performs around celebrities." He turned to face Jean. "But you were genuine and talented." Jean snorted. "If I were talented, I wouldn't be guarding paintings at midnight." "You think talent guarantees success?" Anderson raised an eyebrow. "This business is brutal, Mr. Hackman. It's not always the most talented who succeed, but the most persistent." "I'm running out of persistence," Jean admitted. "And rent money." Anderson nodded thoughtfully. "What I said last night about holding back, I meant it. You have the technical skills, but you're afraid to really feel the words." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "What are you afraid of, Eugene Hackman?" The use of his full name, which Jean hated and never used professionally, caught him off guard. "How do you know my name?" "I asked about you," Anderson said simply, "after I heard you performing for the Rembrandts." Jean felt exposed, vulnerable. "I'm not afraid," he insisted, but even to his own ears, it sounded hollow. "Everyone's afraid," Anderson replied. "Real actors use that fear. They don't hide from it." For a long moment they stood in silence among the abstract paintings, expressions of raw emotion frozen on canvas. Then Anderson sighed. "I'm teaching a masterclass at the Actors Studio next week. Invitation only." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "Tuesday, 2 p.m. Don't be late." Jean stared at the card, unable to believe what was happening. The Actors Studio was the most prestigious acting workshop in the country. Studying there was a dream even beyond Broadway. For most actors. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why me?" Anderson's expression softened. "Because 30 years ago I was a security guard too, at the Metropolitan, and someone saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself yet." He gestured to the Pollock. Raw, material, unrefined but real. With that he turned and walked away, leaving Jean standing there holding the small white card that could change everything. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Jean made his rounds automatically, his mind replaying the conversation with Anderson over and over. By morning, he half expected to discover the whole thing had been a dream, but the card in his pocket was real, solid evidence that it had happened. As dawn broke over New York, Gene Hackman stepped out into a city that looked somehow different than it had the day before. The same streets, the same buildings, but now filled with possibility. The rain had stopped, and the early morning light caught the puddles, turning ordinary sidewalks into mirrors reflecting the sky. He clutched the invitation in his pocket, a small rectangle of hope. For the first time in months, Eugene Hackman allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his father had been wrong after all. Tuesday arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that sometimes blesses New York in early autumn. Gene had barely slept since his encounter with Richard Anderson, alternating between euphoria and terror at the opportunity before him. He'd spent every free moment preparing, practicing in front of the cracked mirror in the bathroom he shared with Brian and Daniel, much to their annoyance. "Either you've finally lost it, or something big is happening," Daniel Jackson commented over breakfast, watching Jean mutter lines while buttering toast. "Which is it?" Jean hesitated. He hadn't told his roommates about the invitation, partly out of superstition. Speaking it aloud might somehow jinx it, and partly because he couldn't bear their sympathy if it all turned out to be an elaborate joke. "Just an audition," he said finally. Brian Williams raised an eyebrow. "Must be. Some audition. You've been talking to yourself more than usual." Jean managed a smile. "It could be important." At 1 o'clock, he left their cramped apartment wearing his only good shirt and the navy blazer he saved for special occasions. The walk to the actor's studio on West 44th Street took exactly 47 minutes. He'd timed it twice the day before, but Jean left early, too restless to stay in the apartment any longer. The actor's studio occupied an unassuming building, its plain facade belying its significance in the theater world. Inside those walls, the likes of Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Marilyn Monroe had honed their craft under the guidance of Lee Strasberg and other masters of method acting. And now, somehow, Gene Hackman was about to join them, or at least enter the building. He arrived 30 minutes early, his palms sweating despite the cool temperature. The lobby was quiet, with just a receptionist at a small desk. She looked up as he entered. "Can I help you?" Gene cleared his throat. "I'm here for Richard Anderson's masterclass." She consulted a list. "Name? Eugene Hackman." Her finger traced down the page and Gene held his breath. What if his name wasn't there? What if Anderson had forgotten or changed his mind? "Yes, here you are." She smiled. "You're early. You can wait in room 3B. Down the hall, second door on the left." Relief flooded through him. "Thank you." Room 3B was a small rehearsal space with a circle of chairs and a few basic props. It was empty when Gene arrived, so he took a seat and tried to calm his racing heart. Gradually, others began to filter in, mostly young actors like himself. Some he recognized from auditions around the city. There were about 15 in all, each looking as nervous and excited as he felt. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened and Richard Anderson walked in. The room immediately fell silent. Anderson surveyed the group, his expression unreadable. Today, he wore casual clothes, dark slacks and a turtleneck sweater that somehow made him look even more distinguished. Without preamble, he moved to the center of the circle. "Acting," he began, "is not about pretending, it's about revealing. Today, we're going to strip away the performance and find the truth beneath." His eyes swept the room, briefly meeting Gene's. "Who wants to go first?" "No one moved." Anderson smiled slightly. "Courage is the first requirement for any artist. Without it, technique is meaningless." He pointed at a young woman with short blonde hair. "You, what's your name?" "Ashley Turner," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Ashley, show us a moment of genuine fear." She blinked. "Should I prepare something?" "No." Anderson's voice was gentle but firm. "Just show us fear, real fear, now." Ashley stood awkwardly, clearly at a loss. She made a few hesitant gestures, her face contorting in what was obviously a performance of fear rather than the emotion itself. "Stop," Anderson said after a few moments. "You're showing us what you think fear looks like. That's not what I asked for." He turned to a young man. "Your name?" "Christopher Quinn." "Same task, genuine fear. Now." Christopher did little better, though his attempt was more physically committed. One by one, Anderson called on different students, and one by one, they struggled with the seemingly simple instruction. Gene watched, increasingly aware that his turn was coming and equally unsure how he would respond when it did. What did Anderson want? How could anyone summon genuine fear on command? Finally, Anderson's gaze settled on him. "Mr. Hackman, your turn." Jean stood, his mouth dry. "What exactly are you looking for?" "I'm not looking for anything," Anderson replied. "I'm asking you to stop looking, to stop performing, and simply be afraid." Jean nodded, taking a deep breath. He closed his eyes, trying to find the emotion within himself. What was he afraid of? Failing. Returning home defeated, proving his father right. He opened his eyes and began to speak, reciting Hamlet's soliloquy, the same one Anderson had heard him practicing in the museum. "Stop!" Anderson interrupted almost immediately. "That's not what I asked for. No lines, no characters, just you afraid." Heat rushed to Jean's face. "I don't understand what you want." "That's closer," Anderson said, surprising him. "Frustration. Embarrassment. We're getting to something real now." He stepped closer. "What are you afraid of right now, in this moment?" Jean swallowed hard. "Failing this exercise, wasting this opportunity, disappointing you." "Good. Now show us." "I am showing." "You," Jean replied, an edge entering his voice. "This is what my fear looks like. It doesn't look like shaking or crying or whatever theatrical version you're expecting." A murmur ran through the group. No one spoke to Richard Anderson that way. But to everyone's surprise, Anderson smiled. "Now we're getting somewhere. Sit down, Mr. Hackman." Jean returned to his seat, unsure if he'd just ruined everything or somehow passed a test. Anderson addressed the group. "The problem with most of you is that you're trying to show me fear according to some external standard. What you think fear should look like based on what you've seen others do. But real emotion doesn't perform for an audience. It simply exists." He gestured to Jean. "Mr. Hackman here finally gave me something honest. Frustration, embarrassment, even a little anger. Not what I asked for, but at least it was real." For the next 3 hours, Anderson pushed them relentlessly, demanding authenticity in every exercise. By the end, everyone was emotionally exhausted but exhilarated. Jean had never experienced anything like it. The brutal honesty, the stripping away of artifice, the demand for truth above all else. As the class ended, Anderson addressed them one final time. "Same time Thursday. Between now and then, I want you to observe, not people on stage or screen, but real people in real situations. Watch how they express joy, sorrow, anger, without performing it." His eyes found Jean's. "Some of you might be interested in observing the late shift at the Museum of Modern Art. I hear the security guards there can be quite expressive." There were confused looks, but Jean felt a rush of warmth at what was clearly a private joke between them. As the group dispersed, Anderson motioned for Jean to stay behind. When they were alone, the older actor's demeanor softened slightly. "You have good instincts when you're not overthinking," he said. "But you're still holding back." "I'm trying." "Not to," Jean replied honestly. "Trying is your problem. Stop trying. Just be." Anderson studied him for a moment. "There's a production of Death of a Salesman being cast next month. Off-Broadway, but good people involved. I think you should audition for Biff." Jean stared at him. "You think I'm ready for something like that?" "No," Anderson said bluntly, "but readiness is overrated. Sometimes you need to be thrown into the deep end." He scribbled something on a piece of paper. "Go to this address next Wednesday, 10 a.m. Ask for Michelle Freeman. Tell her I sent you." Jean took the paper, almost afraid to hope. "Why are you helping me?" Anderson was quiet for a moment. "Because 30 years ago, I was angry and scared and convinced I didn't have what it took. Someone saw past all that to what was underneath." He shrugged. "Consider it paying a debt." With that, he gathered his things and left, leaving Jean alone. In the rehearsal room, holding another small piece of paper that somehow weighed as much as his future. The week that followed passed in a blur of rehearsals, classes, and night shifts at the museum. Gene continued to attend Anderson's masterclass twice a week, gradually finding his voice among the talented group of actors. Though Anderson never singled him out for special attention during the sessions, there was an unspoken understanding. Between them, a connection forged in their late-night conversations at the museum. Gene hadn't told anyone about the audition yet, not even his roommates. Something in him wanted to keep it private, protected from the well-meaning but sometimes crushing weight of others' expectations. But as Wednesday approached, the secret became harder to contain. "You're different lately," Daniel Jackson observed, over dinner Tuesday night. "More focused." Brian Williams nodded in agreement. Whatever that audition was, it must have gone well. Gene hesitated, then decided it was time. "Richard Anderson is mentoring me," he said, the words sounding strange, even to his own ears. "He's gotten me an audition for Death of a Salesman tomorrow." The silence that followed was profound. Brian and Daniel exchanged looks of disbelief. "Richard Anderson," Daniel repeated. "The Richard Anderson. How did that happen?" Gene told them. The whole story. The late-night encounter at the museum, the masterclass invitation, the unexpected connection that had formed between himself and the Broadway legend. "That's incredible," Brian said when he finished. "Things like that don't happen in real life." "Apparently they do," Gene replied with a small smile. "At least once." The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, a fitting backdrop for a play about broken dreams and false promises. Gene dressed carefully in his interview suit, slightly out of fashion but the best he had, and took the subway to the address Anderson had given him. It was a small theater in the village, its lobby adorned with posters from past productions. A young woman sat at a desk near the entrance, leafing through a script. "Excuse me," Gene said. "I'm looking for Michelle Freeman." The woman looked up, her expression curious. "That's me. I'm Eugene Hackman. Richard Anderson sent me for the Biff audition." Recognition dawned in her eyes. "Oh, yes, Richard mentioned you. You're a bit early, but that's good." She stood, extending her hand. "I'm the assistant director." Gene shook her hand, fighting to keep his nervousness from showing. "Nice to meet you." Michelle led him through the lobby into the theater itself, an intimate space with perhaps 200 seats facing a small but well-appointed stage. 3 people sat in the front row, engaged in quiet conversation. "Walter," Michelle called. "Richard's recommendation is here." A man in his 50s turned, scrutinizing Gene with sharp eyes. "Mr. Hackman, is it? Richard speaks highly of you, which is rare enough to be noteworthy." He gestured to the stage. "Are you familiar with the play?" "Yes, sir," Gene replied. "I've studied it extensively." "Good. We'll have you read with Christine. She's playing Linda. Act 1, the scene where Biff returns home. Whenever you're ready." Gene nodded, taking a deep breath as he climbed the steps. To the stage, a woman in her 40s, Christine Gentry, according to the name he'd heard, smiled encouragingly at him. Don't worry," she said quietly. "Walter seems tough, but he's actually a marshmallow." Gene managed a grateful smile in return, though his heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He took his position, closed his eyes for a moment, and thought of what Anderson had taught him. "Don't perform, be." "Happy to see me, Mom," he began, stepping into Biff's skin. For the next 10 minutes, Gene lost himself in the scene, the words flowing through him with an authenticity he'd never quite achieved before. He felt Biff's conflicted emotions, the love for his mother, the complicated relationship with his father, the weight of being the repository of so many broken dreams. When the scene ended, there was a moment of silence. "Thank you, Mr. Hackman," Walter said, his expression unreadable. "Can you stay for a call back this afternoon? We'd like to see you read with William, our Willie Loman." Gene's pulse quickened. "Yes, absolutely." "Good. Be back at 2. Outside the theater, Gene stood in the light rain, too wired to sit, too anxious to eat. He walked the village streets, rehearsing lines in his head, trying not to get his hopes up too high. A callback was good. Great even, but far from a guarantee. At exactly 2 o'clock, he returned to find the theater more crowded. Several other actors had arrived, each presumably hoping for the role of Biff or one of the other characters. Gene recognized a few faces from auditions around the city. More experienced actors, some with credits to their names. His confidence wavered. One by one, they were called to read. Gene watched each performance carefully, noting the different interpretations of Biff's character. Some played him as angry, others as lost, others as deliberately defiant. All were good, professional, polished. When his turn came again, Gene took the stage with William Richardson, a veteran character actor playing Willie. The scene was the climactic confrontation between father and son, one of the most emotionally devastating moments in American theater. "I am not a leader of men, Willie, and neither are you," Gene began, feeling Biff's desperation and love and rage all at once. "You were never anything but a hard-working drummer who landed in the ash can like all the rest of them." As the scene progressed, something extraordinary happened. Gene stopped thinking about technique, about impressing the directors, about getting the job. He simply existed in Biff's pain, in the terrible moment of trying to make his father see the truth about both of them. When he delivered the final lines, "I'm nothing, Pop, can't you understand that? There's no spite in it anymore. I'm just what I am, that's all." There were tears in his eyes, real tears, not the performed emotion he might have attempted before Anderson's teaching. Silence fell over the theater. William Richardson, a man who had performed with the greatest actors of his generation, was staring at Gene with something like wonder. Walter stood. "Thank you, Mr. Hackman. We'll be in touch." Gene left the stage feeling oddly light, as if something fundamental had shifted inside him. Whether he got the part or not seemed almost secondary to what he had just experienced, a moment of complete artistic truth. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight broke through the clouds. Gene was about to head for the subway when a familiar voice called his name. "I thought I might find you here." Richard Anderson stood across the street, looking exactly as he had that first night at the museum, unassuming yet somehow commanding. "Were you watching?" Gene asked as the older actor approached. From the back row, "Walter doesn't like me interfering with his casting process." Anderson's eyes twinkled, though in this case, I made an exception. They began walking together, no particular destination in mind. "Well," Gene couldn't help asking, "what did you think?" "I think," Anderson said carefully, "that you finally stopped trying to be a good actor and simply became Biff Loman for a few minutes." He glanced at Gene. "It's addictive, isn't it? That feeling of disappearing into someone else's skin?" Gene nodded, unable to find the words to describe what had happened on that stage. "You'll get the part," Anderson continued matter-of-factly. "Walter would be a fool not to cast you, and whatever else he may be, he's no fool." Gene felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by caution. There were some really good actors there. "Yes," Anderson agreed. "Professional, competent, well-trained actors. But art isn't about competence, Gene. It's about truth. And for those few minutes, you found it." He stopped walking, turning to face the younger man. "That's what I saw in you that night at the museum. Not polish or technique, but the capacity for truth." They stood there on the village sidewalk. Two men separated by age and experience, but united by an understanding that went beyond words. "Thank you," Gene said finally, "for seeing something in me I couldn't see in myself." Anderson waved away the gratitude. "Remember this feeling. There will be days, many days, when the business tries to beat it out of you, when directors want something safe and familiar, when critics miss the point entirely. Remember what it felt like to disappear into Biff Loman and find something honest there, With that, he shook Gene's hand and walked away, blending into the New York crowd like any ordinary man. Not a Broadway legend, not a mentor, just someone who had once been where Gene was now and had reached back to offer a hand. 3 months later, on a frigid January evening, Gene Hackman stood in the wings of the small off-Broadway theater, listening to the murmur of the audience settling into their seats. Opening night. After weeks of rehearsals, rewrites, technical problems, and the 1,000 natural shocks that theatrical productions are heir to, Death of a Salesman was about to meet its first real audience. "Nervous?" asked Michelle Freeman, appearing beside him with a clipboard. Gene considered the question. Oddly, no. More like, "Ready," she smiled. Richard's in the audience, 3rd row, center. His pulse quickened at that. Though Anderson had kept his distance during rehearsals, "Walter needs to be your director now, not me," he'd explained. His influence remained. Gene had continued attending the masterclass when his rehearsal schedule allowed, soaking up the older actor's wisdom like a sponge. "Places in 5, called the stage manager, and the cast scattered for their final preparations. In the small dressing room he shared with David Brown, who played Happy, Gene sat before the mirror, studying his reflection. The past months had changed him in subtle ways. There was a confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a centeredness he was still getting used to. The door opened and Walter poked his head in. "A word, Gene." They stepped into the hallway, Gene bracing for last-minute notes or changes. Instead, Walter simply gripped his shoulder. "Remember what we talked about in rehearsal yesterday about Biff's journey?" Gene nodded, finding the courage to reject the false promise and embrace his truth. "That's it. That's the whole play, right there." Walter's usually gruff demeanor softened. "You've done remarkable work, Gene. Trust it. Trust yourself out there tonight." Coming from Walter, who was sparing with praise at the best of times, this was equivalent to a standing ovation. Gene felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you for taking a chance on me." Walter snorted. "I didn't take a chance. I made a calculated decision based on your audition. Richard may have gotten you in the door, but you earned the part." He checked his watch. "Now get ready. It's almost time." The call came for places, and Gene took his position in the darkness backstage. The house lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. Then the stage lights rose, and the play began. For the next 3 hours, Gene lived as Biff Loman, the golden boy turned drifter, the son struggling to free himself from his father's impossible dreams. When he delivered the play's emotional climax, "Pop, I'm nothing, Pop," he felt the audience holding its collective breath, caught in the devastating truth of the moment. And then it was over. The lights dimmed on Willie Loman's funeral, Linda's final speech echoing in the darkness. We're free. A moment of silence, then thunderous applause. The cast took their bows, Gene stepping forward for his featured acknowledgement to cheers and whistles. His eyes scanned the audience, finding Richard Anderson exactly where Michelle had said he would be. The older actor was on his feet, applauding with unabashed enthusiasm. Backstage was chaos, congratulations, flowers, the giddy relief of a successful opening. Gene moved through it in a daze, accepting compliments and hugs, still partly caught. In Biff's world, Mr. Hackman, a stagehand, approached. "There's someone asking for you at the stage door." Expecting Anderson, Gene was surprised to find a different man waiting, older, weathered, with the same strong jawline that Gene saw in the mirror each morning. "Dad?" Frederick Hackman stood awkwardly in the narrow hallway, a newspaper folded under his arm. "Hello, son." They stared at each other, 3 years of silence stretching between them. Gene had written to his father when he'd gotten the part, not expecting a response, and hadn't received one. "What are you doing here?" Gene asked, unable to keep the shock from his voice. "Got your letter?" his father replied, as if that explained everything. "Thought I should see for myself." Jean struggled to process this unexpected development. You came all the way from Danville? Train got in this morning. Frederick shifted uncomfortably. You were good up there. Real good. From his father, this was the equivalent of a rave review. Jean felt something hard and knotted begin to loosen in his chest. Thank you for coming, he said simply. Frederick nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. Found this when your mother was clearing out the attic. Thought you might want it. Jean took the photo. It showed a much younger Frederick Hackman in costume for a community theater production of Our Town, a detail from his father's life Jean had never known about. You did theater? He asked, stunned. High school, little bit after. Frederick shrugged. Wasn't any good at it. Not like you. Before Jean could respond to this revelation, he felt a presence behind him and turned to find Richard Anderson watching. Their exchange with interest, Mr. Hackman, Anderson said, extending his hand to Frederick. Richard Anderson, I've had the pleasure of working with your son these past few months. Recognition dawned in Frederick's eyes. You're the one from the movies, the Shakespeare fella, Anderson smiled. Among other things, yes. An awkward silence fell. 3 generations of actors, one who had given up the dream, one who had achieved it, and one just beginning, standing in the cramped backstage hallway. Your son has remarkable talent, Anderson said finally. It's been an honor to help him find his way. Frederick's expression was complicated. Pride and regret and something like gratitude all mingled together. Seems like he found the right teacher. The talent was always there, Anderson replied. It just needed someone to recognize it. He turned to Jean. The theater's hosting a small reception next door. Your father would be welcome to join us. With that, he tactfully withdrew, leaving father and son alone again. You don't have to stay, Jean said, though part of him desperately hoped his father would. Frederick hesitated. Came all this way, he said finally. Might as well have a drink. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was a beginning. A door, opening where before there had been only a wall. As they made their way to the reception, Jean spotted Anderson across the crowded lobby, deep in conversation with Walter. The older actor caught his eye and raised his glass in a silent toast. To Jean, to the performance, to the strange and wonderful chain of events that had led them all here. Later that night, after the celebration had wound down, Jean found himself walking the same rain-washed streets he had traversed as a security guard just months before. His father was settled in a hotel nearby, with plans to see the show again before returning to Danville. The city felt different somehow, or perhaps it was Jean himself who had changed, finding his place in the vast, chaotic ecosystem of New York theater. He paused outside the Museum of Modern Art, dark and silent at this late hour. Through those doors, on a night much like this one, he had met the man who would change his life, not through connections or favors, but by recognizing something essential in him and helping him find the courage to reveal it. From security guard to actor, from doubt to purpose, Gene Hackman's journey was just beginning, but he now walked the path with certainty, his steps no longer hounded by his father's ghost or his own fears. Ahead lay Broadway, Hollywood, a career that would establish him as one of the most respected actors of his generation. But in this moment, standing in the gentle rain outside the museum where it all began, Gene simply felt the profound peace of a man who had found his truth. Richard Anderson's words echoed in his mind, "Acting is not about pretending, it's about revealing." On stage tonight, Gene Hackman had revealed himself to the audience, to his father, and most importantly, to himself. And in that revelation, he had found not just a career, but a calling. With one last look at the museum, Gene turned toward home, the future unfolding before him like the pages of a script waiting to be performed.